My name is Eleanor. I'm in my 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've made a quiet living inside loud places. Open offices, fast deadlines, polished meetings where the smartest sentence isn't always the one that gets remembered. People usually describe me with words that sound harmless, steady, pleasant, low maintenance. The kind of person you don't worry about because I don't seem like I need anything. And that perception, being easy to overlook, can feel like a compliment until you realize what it really means. I'm rarely seen as a threat, rarely seen as competition, rarely seen at all. This story isn't a revenge fantasy. It's not a takedown. It's not a watch me destroy them spectacle. It's a confession, told carefully and honestly, because what I did harmed someone who didn't deserve it. And it also revealed something uncomfortable about how workplaces reward certain instincts and punish others. I ruined a better coworker by fabricating a harassment claim. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of someone who started out wanting stability, then drifted into resentment, then convinced herself she was simply protecting her future. It's a story about how small dismissals stack up, how quiet people learn to keep receipts, and how a room full of bystanders can become the most powerful accomplice without ever meaning to. I'll walk you through who I was at that job, how I tried to stay neutral, how I tried to be liked without asking to be chosen. I'll introduce you to the coworker I couldn't outperform, the one who did everything right, in a way that made me feel like I was always doing something slightly wrong. I'll show you the moment I stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as an obstacle. Then we'll move through the shift, the private rationalizations, the subtle positioning, and the single irreversible decision that turned my quiet into something strategic and cruel. You'll hear what it felt like to watch the consequences unfold while everyone around me acted like they were just responding to protocol. And finally, I'll tell you what it cost. Not in a dramatic courtroom way, in the slower way. The way your name changes shape inside your own mouth. The way you realize you can win and still be the one who loses. I'm not telling this to be admired. I'm telling it because I don't want to pretend I was a victim in a story where I became the villain, softly, politely, and with a smile that made people trust me. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently, because it matters for everything that comes next. Have you ever done something you could justify in the moment and only understood the damage after it was already permanent? When I first joined the company, I learned quickly what I was to them. Not from anything anyone said outright, but from the way conversations curved around me. I was the dependable one, the person who took notes when no one else volunteered, the one who filled in gaps without being asked. Who stayed late? Not because I was ambitious, but because unfinished work made me anxious. I answered emails thoroughly. I didn't interrupt. I smiled at the right moments. In meetings, my ideas were usually acknowledged with a nod, sometimes repeated later by someone else, louder, and received with enthusiasm that hadn't been there the first time. No one disliked me. That was the problem. I wasn't invisible in the dramatic sense. People remembered my name. They trusted me. They just didn't look at me for very long. I existed in the category of safe. Safe to overlook, safe to lean on, safe to assume I'd adapt. If you asked my manager, she would have said I was solid, reliable, a team player, not flashy, but consistent. And for a while, I took pride in that. I told myself I didn't need attention to feel secure. I believed that competence would eventually speak for itself, quietly, as I did. Then there was her. She arrived 6 months after I did, and immediately changed the temperature of the room. Not by being loud, but by being undeniable. She had the kind of confidence that didn't ask permission. Her ideas landed cleanly. When she spoke, people leaned in without realizing they were doing it. She wasn't aggressive. She was precise. And she was better than me in ways that mattered. She finished projects faster. She anticipated questions I hadn't even considered. When leadership talked about future potential, her name surfaced naturally, as if it had always belonged there. To them, she was promising. To me, she was a mirror I hadn't asked for. What made it harder was that she wasn't cruel. She didn't undermine me. She wasn't arrogant. She even thanked me for the help, sincerely. That gratitude stung more than dismissal would have. because it reminded me that my role was supportive, auxiliary, the person who made someone else's excellence smoother. Over time, I noticed how people spoke to me versus how they spoke to her. With me, there was warmth but no urgency. With her, there was focus, curiosity, a subtle respect that carried weight. When mistakes happened, mine were quietly corrected. Hers were discussed, analyzed, and framed as learning opportunities. I told myself not to compare. I told myself comparison was petty, unprofessional. But comparison isn't always about ego. It's about survival, about understanding where you stand when resources are limited and futures are decided behind closed doors. In group settings, I was often assigned the invisible labor, organizing, following up, smoothing tensions, work that mattered, but never enough to be celebrated, work that made others shine while keeping me dim. And I accepted it, I even defended it. I told myself I was lucky to be trusted, that I didn't need validation, that ambition was overrated. I wore humility like armor, not realizing how heavy it had become. What I didn't say out loud, what I barely admitted to myself, was that I was afraid. Afraid that if I reached for more, I'd be exposed as less. Afraid that my calm demeanor wasn't a strength, but camouflage. To them, I was stable background noise in a workplace that rewarded signal. To myself, I was someone waiting her turn in a system that didn't operate in turns. And the most dangerous part? No one ever told me to stay small. They just never gave me a reason to believe I could be big. At least, not without pushing someone else out of the frame. The first moment didn't arrive with drama. No raised voices. No sharp exchange anyone would remember later. That's how these things usually begin. Not as wounds, but as abrasions, easy to dismiss, easier to explain away. We were in a project review meeting. Nothing high stakes, just a routine checkpoint with a few senior leads dialed in. I had prepared the background research, numbers, context, the quiet scaffolding that made the presentation hold together. She was presenting the conclusions. At one point, a question came up about an assumption in the data. I answered it, not confidently, not performatively, just clearly. I explained why we'd chosen that direction and what trade-offs it involved. There was a pause. Then one of the directors smiled politely and said, "Let's hear what she thinks." He nodded toward her. She repeated what I just said, nearly word for word, added one sentence at the end, something about next steps. The director nodded, satisfied. "Exactly," he said. "That's the kind of thinking we need more of." No one noticed. Or maybe they noticed and decided it didn't matter. The meeting moved on. My name was never mentioned again. I told myself it was nothing. Those meetings are messy. That credit isn't a zero-sum game. That I didn't need recognition to know my value. I even felt embarrassed for feeling the sting at all, as if noticing it made me small. But later that day, when she thanked me for the prep work, something tightened in my chest. She meant it kindly. I knew that. She wasn't stealing, she was being seen. And that difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. After that, the cuts came more frequently. Still small, still defensible. An email chain where my suggestion went unanswered, until she reframed it 2 hours later and received immediate buy-in. A meeting invite where I was added as optional while she was marked essential. A comment from a manager praising initiative directed at her for work we had collaborated on evenly. Each time I rationalized, they're responding to confidence. She communicates better. This is how teams work. And maybe all of that was true. But what I noticed, what I couldn't unsee, was how easily the room adjusted around her, how quickly authority aligned with her voice, and how naturally I slid into the background, even when I'd been there first. The most painful part wasn't being overlooked. It was being overlooked consistently, in ways that formed a pattern no one else seemed to track. I started remembering details. Who interrupted whom? Who got follow-up questions? Who was asked to circle back? And who was asked to take the lead? I didn't write anything down, not yet, but my mind kept a ledger. Still, I said nothing. Silence felt safer than sounding resentful. And resentment, I told myself, was the mark of someone who couldn't compete cleanly. So I worked harder. I polished more. I made myself indispensable in ways that were invisible by design. I believed that if I just stayed composed long enough, the system would correct itself. That belief lasted until the day a senior manager casually said to me, "You're great at supporting strong performers." He meant it as praise. I smiled and thanked him. Inside, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to register. It was the first time I understood that the role I was playing wasn't temporary. It was how they saw me. And once you're seen a certain way, every small cut lands deeper because it confirms a story you never agreed to tell. What happens when something repeats often enough is that it stops feeling like an incident and starts feeling like weather. You don't argue with it, you dress for it, you plan around it, you tell yourself it's unreasonable to expect sunshine every day. That's what the dismissals became: predictable, almost polite. No single moment is dramatic enough to call out, no clear villain to point at, just a steady erosion that trained me to expect less from the room and more from myself. I adjusted without realizing I was doing it. I began prefacing my ideas with disclaimers. This might be obvious, but I waited for pauses that never came. I offered help before anyone asked, because being useful felt safer than being visible. When she spoke, people listened. When I spoke, people nodded and checked their screens. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that not everyone needs to lead, that influence can be quiet, that maturity means not needing applause. These were adult thoughts, reasonable thoughts, the kind that makes you sound grounded when you repeat them to yourself. But there was another voice underneath them, quieter, more persistent. Why not you? Why is your contribution always the preface and never the conclusion? I didn't like that voice. It sounded needy, ungrateful, so I learned to drown it out with productivity. I became the person who fixed things before they broke, who anticipated moods, who remembered birthdays and deadlines and unspoken tensions. Emotional labor masquerading as professionalism, the kind that earns appreciation but never leverage. And in that environment, disrespect didn't look like cruelty. It looked like an assumption. The assumption that I'd take notes, the assumption that I'd be fine staying late, the assumption that I wouldn't push back. No one ever told me I couldn't speak up. They just never paused long enough to invite me in. There were moments, small ones, where I could have said something, corrected the record, asked for clarity, claimed space. But every time I considered it, I imagined how it would land. Defensive, insecure, overly sensitive. I'd seen what happened to people, especially women, who challenged narratives too directly. How quickly they were reframed as difficult. How tone mattered more than truth. How emotion, even justified, was treated as a liability. So I stayed calm. Calm became my currency, composure, my shield. And slowly, I began to accept a version of the story that didn't favor me, because resisting it felt riskier than living inside it. The irony is that the more I swallowed, the more the environment interpreted my silence as consent. My flexibility is a lack of ambition. My patience is contentment. They thought they were respecting my boundaries. I was erasing them. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who think you're doing fine, from having your discomfort mistaken for preference, from realizing that if you disappeared tomorrow, the system would absorb the loss without disruption, because you designed yourself to be replaceable. I remember one afternoon, sitting at my desk after a meeting where my contribution had been summarized by someone else and praised as great synthesis. I stared at the screen and felt something settle in me. Not anger, not sadness, resignation. That's when disrespect becomes normalized. When you stop asking whether something is fair and start asking whether it's worth the energy to care. I told myself I was being strategic, that staying quiet preserved relationships, that professionalism meant endurance. And maybe that was true, up to a point. But endurance without acknowledgement doesn't build strength. It builds pressure. And pressure, when it has nowhere to go, doesn't disappear. It changes shape. At the time, I didn't know what that shape would be. I only knew that something in me had started keeping score. Not out of spite, but out of self-protection. I wasn't planning anything yet. I was just learning how the system worked. And more importantly, how it failed people like me without ever meaning to. Roles don't arrive with contracts. No one sits you down and explains them. They form quietly, through repetition, through expectation, through the subtle relief people feel when you behave exactly as predicted. By that point, my role was clear. I was the stabilizer. When projects wobbled, I smoothed them. When personalities clashed, I softened the edges. When deadlines crept too close, I absorbed the overflow. I was reliable in the way furniture is reliable, noticed only when it's missing or in the way. People came to me with problems, not possibilities. They trusted me with details, not decisions. And because I always delivered, the role solidified. I saw it most clearly during a reorganization meeting. Leadership was discussing future team leads, tossing around names with the casual authority of people who assumed the room would agree. Hers came up quickly. So did a few others. Mine did not. Instead, someone said, Eleanor would be great at supporting whoever takes this on. The sentence floated there, unchallenged, reasonable, practical, almost kind. I nodded like I always did. Inside, something registered, not surprise, but confirmation. This wasn't an oversight, it was alignment. They had assigned me a place that fit their experience of me. Dependable, adaptable, non-threatening, someone who made others better without asking to be better herself. And the uncomfortable truth was that I had helped write that script. Every time I chose harmony over clarity, every time I downplayed my ambition to seem easy, every time I accepted praise for effort instead of impact, I had taught them what to expect. The coworker I couldn't compete with, she had taught them something different, not intentionally, just by occupying space without apology, by speaking as if she assumed she belonged in the center of the conversation. I watched how leadership leaned on her for vision, while leaning on me for execution. How she was asked where things should go, and I was asked how fast I could get them there. It wasn't unfair in a dramatic way. It was efficient, and that's what made it dangerous. Because efficiency doesn't ask whether a system is just. It asks whether it works. And for them, it worked beautifully. For me, it worked until it didn't. I began to feel trapped by my own reputation. If I pushed for more, it would look out of character. If I challenged decisions, it would feel abrupt. I'd become so consistently agreeable that disagreement itself would read as instability. So I stayed inside the lines. I told myself this was temporary, that visibility would come later, that proving myself again would eventually tip the scales. But deep down, I sensed the truth I didn't want to face. Later was not guaranteed, and proving myself again would only reinforce the role I was already playing. The most painful realization wasn't that I'd been underestimated. It was that I'd been accurately assessed, based on the version of myself I'd made easiest to accept. That understanding didn't arrive as rage. It arrived as clarity. And clarity is dangerous when it meets resentment that has nowhere to go. I started noticing how decisions were made before meetings even began, how narratives are formed in private, how culture fit quietly outweighed contribution, how credibility was less about merit and more about momentum. I saw the invisible rules finally. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. That's when my silence began to change texture. It was no longer passive, it was observant. I stopped assuming good faith automatically. I stopped believing that patience alone would be rewarded. I began to understand that roles once assigned are rarely reconsidered, unless something forces the issue. At the time, I didn't know what that something would be. I only knew I couldn't survive indefinitely as the person who made everyone else's future easier, while quietly compromising her own. The role they gave me had been comfortable. But comfort, I was learning, can be another word for containment, and I was starting to feel the walls. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no email that changed everything, no moment anyone else would remember as significant. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind that barely leaves a footprint. I was sitting alone in a small conference room, waiting for a meeting that had been pushed back twice. My laptop was open, a document half finished. Through the glass wall, I could see people moving through the office, talking, laughing, leaning into each other's momentum. She walked past with two senior managers. They were deep in conversation, animated in that way people get when they feel aligned. She was leading the discussion. They were responding, not directing. I watched them disappear around the corner, and for the first time I didn't feel envy. I felt distance. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Like stepping outside yourself and seeing the situation from above. I realized that no amount of patience was going to place me where she was standing. Not because I lacked ability, but because the system had already decided how to use me. And systems don't change out of kindness. They change when they're disrupted. That was the moment something in me stopped hoping. Hope had kept me compliant. It had softened the edges of reality, convinced me that if I just stayed reasonable, things would resolve themselves. Letting go of it felt like a loss, but also like relief. I closed my laptop and sat there, hands folded, breathing evenly. I wasn't angry, I wasn't plotting, I was assessing. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What leverage do I actually have? Not talent. Talent was abundant, not loyalty. Loyalty had diminishing returns, not effort. Effort, I'd learned, was expected, never rewarded. Leverage was something else. Leverage lived in systems, not intentions, in documentation, in narratives, in the invisible rules that everyone followed but no one discussed openly. I thought about how seriously the company took its values. How often did leadership speak about safety, inclusion, and accountability? How carefully they responded to anything that even hinted at liability. How quickly procedures were activated when certain words were used. I wasn't thinking about using them, not yet. I was noticing them. That distinction mattered to me at the time. I returned to my desk and finished my work. I spoke in meetings, I smiled, I performed my role flawlessly. But internally, something had recalibrated. I stopped measuring myself against her. I stopped wondering how to outshine her. That comparison had exhausted me. Instead, I began to study the environment with a different lens. Not as a participant hoping to be chosen, but as an observer mapping pressure points. I noticed what triggered urgency, what froze decision-making, what made leadership visibly uncomfortable. I noticed how quickly narratives hardened once HR became involved, even peripherally. How neutral processes quietly favored whoever spoke first and sounded most composed. None of this made me feel powerful. It made me feel sober, because with clarity came responsibility, and a question I didn't yet know how to answer. If you know how a system can be bent, are you obligated not to bend it? At the time, I told myself I was just being realistic, that understanding of power dynamics didn't mean I intended to misuse them. That awareness wasn't the same as action, and that was true. But something had shifted all the same. My silence was no longer an endurance. It was deliberation. And once you cross that line, once you begin to see options where you once saw inevitability, there's no going back to innocence. Only one choice. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt awake. After that afternoon, my quiet changed. On the surface, nothing was different. I showed up on time. I met deadlines. I contributed in meetings with the same measured tone that made people comfortable. If anyone had asked, they would have said I was exactly the same Eleanor I'd always been. But internally, my silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I was doing. I stopped filling gaps automatically. When a question hung in the air, I let it. When work spilled beyond reasonable hours, I paused before absorbing it. I watched how quickly discomfort motivated others to act when I didn't rush to soften it. People misread this shift. They thought I was tired, or distracted, or simply less invested. No one imagined a strategy, because a strategy didn't fit the version of me they had filed away. And that misreading gave my silence a new kind of weight. I listened more than I spoke, not out of politeness, but with intention. I noticed patterns in language, how certain phrases triggered procedural responses, how concerns framed as personal evaporated, while concerns framed as risk gained traction. I noticed which emails were archived and which were forwarded, which conversations were documented and which lived safely in hallways. I began keeping my own records, not obsessively, not emotionally, just clearly. Dates, context, language, nothing dramatic, nothing embellished. At the time, I told myself this was self-protection, that everyone should understand how systems work, especially ones that claim to protect people. I wasn't planning to act on anything. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was learning the rules of a game I'd been playing blind. Meanwhile, she continued to rise. She was given more responsibility, more visibility, more trust. I watched leadership lean on her in ways they never leaned on me, asking her to represent the team, to shape direction, to speak on behalf of shared work. And I felt something unexpected, relief. Competing with her directly had been exhausting. Letting go of that competition freed up energy that now went into observation, positioning, and patience. People often misunderstand silence. They assume it means compliance or fear or lack of opinion. They rarely consider that it might mean calculation. In meetings, when conversations drifted into uncomfortable territory, jokes that edged too close to personal, comments that blurred professional boundaries, I didn't react, I didn't laugh, I didn't object, I simply noted. Others filled the silence quickly, eager to move on. That eagerness told me more than any apology would have. I noticed how much faith the organization placed in appearances of fairness, how process mattered more than truth, how neutrality was prized, even when it masked imbalance. And slowly, without ever articulating it out loud, I began to understand something fundamental. The system wasn't designed to find the best outcome. It was designed to find the least disruptive one. That realization didn't make me feel clever. It made me feel cautious. Because once you understand that stability is the highest value, you also understand how easily fear can be leveraged, how quickly leadership will act to contain anything that threatens the image of control, even if the facts are murky. I still wasn't planning anything specific. I want to be clear about that. There was no moment where I said, I'm going to ruin her. That narrative is too simple, too clean. What existed instead was a growing awareness that if a conflict ever arose, if narratives collided, the system would not weigh us equally. It would favor the story that arrived first, sounded calmest, and aligned most closely with institutional anxiety.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.